All right, Dr. Boyd and Kurt, it's been a tough few days following the death of George Floyd. And I was particularly struck, Kurt, by you tweeting out asking for those, particularly whites, who want to do something, what can be done. And so I think it's great that we have Dr. Boyd on the show so that we can have that conversation. Kurt, go ahead, give us your thoughts on what your concerns are and what your questions are.
Well, I tell you what, Jim, Dr. Boyd, the biggest thing is, the emotions for all of us have really run the gamut from anger to sadness and, confusion on how this can still be going on in 2020. But as you mentioned, Jim, the biggest question is, I think there's so many of us out there, and me being one as I've contemplated things over the last week or so, that want to help, that want to lend a hand, that want to make the kind of concrete differences that can change the culture that we live in. Yet I sit here at home wondering, what are those things? What can I do? What can I put my hand to that can truly help make a difference?
Yes, I think, it's interesting to think about being in this moment and, people asking that question, what can they do? And, I think it's a good question. I don't know that there's any sort of immediate, fast, quick solution. My suggestion to anyone is to, first of all, educate themselves about the history of this country, the society we live in, issues like police brutality, and the circumstances surrounding that. What you can do in a moment like this is sort of like, that moment in your house when, the plumbing burst. In that moment, it's an emergency and people start scrambling. But if you make preparations and such, when emergencies happen, you're perhaps better able to deal with it. I really just think it comes down to enough people educating themselves that they recognize we live in a society where there's a list of people whose names we know now. Mr. Floyd is only the latest. Individuals who've been killed by police brutality on camera, other individuals who've been killed by private citizens and they've not been charged for this. So it starts with education. It starts with understanding that this country has a history, and that history manifests itself in these contemporary moments like we're dealing with right now.
Interestingly, last night I reached out to Chargers coach Anthony Lynn, who is African American, and I asked him, are you going to address the weekend's events with your players? And he said, absolutely, they would on Monday after what had taken place. And he also said, look, he said, the uprising for social justice will take a priority over football at this point. And he went on to say, when I asked him what his message would be, he said he didn't know. He said he wanted it to be organic. He wanted it to be player driven. And he wanted the players to be able to be vulnerable so that hopefully when they come through this, they will be better teammates on the opposite side. And Kurt, from a locker room standpoint, I'd like to ask, how important is the head coach in terms of handling this situation and the communication that he has with the players in terms of making sure that everyone feels like they're being heard and that you can proceed as a unit instead of as a fractured group?
Well, Jim, I think it's extremely important for everybody in an organization and everybody in a locker room. Of course, the head coach being the figurehead with an organization, that's extremely important to make sure that he touches and reaches everyone in the locker room. But I think it's vital for everyone in that locker room to open up communication and to connect and to be able to get to know the other person and what they're dealing with, so they can understand how to respond to some of the things that we've talked about. And, it wasn't something that I'll say went on a lot in the locker rooms, when I was going through the league, probably due to the fact that there wasn't as many public displays like we've seen recently. I wish I would have had more of those conversations. I wish I would have been able to connect and understand and listen and learn more than I was able to do, even though I've been in locker rooms my entire life. But I hope that every organization, every head coach, every player sits down and has these conversations. So moving forward, everyone can be allies and everybody can put their best foot forward to stop the injustices that we're seeing.
Dr. Boyd, how important is NFL ownership in this process and this discussion?
Well, I think NFL ownership is extremely important. The entirety of an NFL organization is extremely important. If I might pick up on something Kurt was saying, so often in sports and football, you have this attitude of, it's only about football. We leave everything else outside the locker room. We leave everything else outside the door. It's only about football. And that's certainly understandable. That's the case in most businesses. It's about what that business is. But it's also about human beings. And if human beings are representative of a group of people in American society who've not been treated fairly, who continue to be treated in ways different than other citizens, that becomes an issue, I think, that's appropriate to deal with on a team, in an organization, in a locker room, because we're talking about human beings. Human beings play the game of football. These aren't robots. And there are issues that are specific to human beings in their history. Large percentage of NFL players are African American. This should be part of the conversation. If one of those individuals decides he's upset with what's going on in society and others follow behind him and he wants to engage in some form of silent protest, this individual need not be, silenced or repressed. Maybe everybody doesn't agree with them. That's fine. But the way in which the Kaepernick situation played out, I think, left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth. And it made some people feel as though individuals could not, articulate their right to free speech as we have in this country. And, here we are now in this situation where these things continue. There's unrest all over the country. Perhaps a consideration about how individuals as human beings factor into a team and into a larger organization is something that can take place from the ownership down and from the lowest individual in that organization work-wise up to the top. It has to be, I think, a group effort and ultimately a league effort. The NFL is a very, very successful cultural entity in our society. A large number of the people who play the football games on Sunday are African American. Their lives and their history are not some separate part of their experience. It's an integral part of their overall experience and what this sport and what this game means in terms of American culture. So I think it really has to be something that is supported and embraced by ownership, supported and embraced by administration, coaches, player, everybody involved. I mean, I think what we're seeing is that this doesn't just affect the people most directly identified with it, but it affects everybody. And so until there's some sort of across the court, across the field buy-in, if you will, on all this, we're probably going to be in a situation where there's less forward movement than we need.
Well, Dr. Boyd, Kurt Warner, I want to thank you both for an open and important discussion. Kurt, 4 years ago when Colin first took a knee to protest police brutality against people of color, we didn't hear a lot from white players, and in particular, highly visible white quarterbacks. I'm wondering from your standpoint, what's the conversation like in the locker room among black and white players about this issue, that perhaps when you don't have players who will come out publicly and discuss it?
I think the conversation, Jim, really falls to, without question, there are many guys in locker rooms across the country that want to stand or kneel or associate or connect or do whatever that is with our black brothers in those same locker rooms. I think the question oftentimes falls to, we understand that we don't understand. We often use a term in the NFL, you don't know what you don't know. And I think the fact is, I know I don't know. I know I don't understand what my black brothers go through on a daily basis, on a weekly basis around the country. And I think that's where it gets very difficult for us to understand, okay, how do we connect with this? How do we show, that we're behind them, that we're with them, that we're holding hands with them? What does that look like for us in those types of situations? You used Colin Kaepernick as an example, but I think there's a lot of different ways that we could connect that. And that, to me, always, I think, lends itself to trying to get answers on What does that look like for us? How do we associate that, even though we can't fully grasp and understand the situations that the black culture is dealing with?
What's interesting is that 4 years ago, Josh McCown was one of the few white players who spoke out publicly about what was going on. And I'll never forget him discussing how he was in an off-season Bible study meeting with active players and former players, many of them black. And he listened as these men gave their life experience about things they had experienced in dealing with law enforcement and whatnot. And he said at that point, he really realized that they were going through life with a weighted vest on. And he was one of the few that spoke out about it. But since George Floyd's death, we have heard prominent quarterbacks speak out, white quarterbacks speak out, whether it's Carson Wentz, Ryan Tannehill, Derek Carr, Joey Burrow, and even on the college level, Trevor Lawrence. And I'm wondering, Dr. Boyd, how important is that, and what does that mean going forward in terms of this fight to have players like that speaking out, in particular at the most visible position in the NFL?
Well, I think you tap into, some of the longstanding issues about race and representation in our society. I remember being, here on the NFL Network 4 years ago with Kurt Warner and Jim Brown, right after Colin Kaepernick initially started taking a seat during the national anthem. This was before he began taking a knee. Of course, Colin Kaepernick has not played in the league in a long time. There were people who were upset about his method of protesting, and I kept thinking over the last 3 or 4 days that we've seen, rebellions break out across the country. I kept thinking about how a lot of people felt as though Kaepernick's protest, which was especially passive, by contrast, was problematic. But we've seen the alternative the last few days. So I think we have to look at this situation and appreciate the fact that had more individuals spoken out, individuals like you mentioned, the quarterback position in the NFL has its own unique racial history. Quarterbacks on NFL teams have traditionally been white. There's been a lot of discussion about that. But when individuals like that see themselves as allies and want to help, as Kurt Warner said, his black brothers, I think it's a good thing, and it puts pressure on people in positions of power to make appropriate decisions. And I think, unfortunately, in Colin Kaepernick's case, that has not happened. But what I've seen in the aftermath of recent events suggests that maybe now a group of other people feel as though, even though they may not be directly implicated, that they can lend their voice to what in this case is the right thing that they should be helping to support. And so it's appreciated, but at the same time, it's not a situation where we should just be going around, patting certain people on the back because they stood up and spoke out when it was convenient. This is a thing that you have to engage yourself in every day at all times. It's not just when, circumstances like this erupt, but it has to be a more thorough embrace of race and representation, racism, and how these issues manifest themselves in our society.
And Doc, as we're listening and trying to learn and understand the proper responses, what else would you have me do? What else can I do to lend my voice or to lend my position to this cause?
I think the answer to that is fairly straightforward. We've always had this metaphor in our society of, what's it like in the other person's shoes? I think when we talk about race in our society, when we talk about the history of this country, a lot of people have come to America and had a great experience. Their families have had great experiences over generations, and other people's experience in America has been troubled and problematic and quite the opposite of those who've most benefited. that seems simple, but I think learning, privilege, learning that the police don't treat everyone the same, learning that just because a police officer said something doesn't necessarily mean it's true, learning that, when people look at a black man in our society, they see fear, they see danger, they see threat, and they react accordingly. This seems really simple, but I think, to understand what does it mean as best as possible to be a black person, a black man in American society, and how people react to that in pros and cons, in positives and negatives. Like, it's really just about understanding somebody else's perspective. And if you are a good, honest, decent person, I think you can see injustice and you act accordingly. But so often what we've seen, Kurt, are people, saying, hey, in so many words, that doesn't affect me. That doesn't, impact my life. It's not my issue. It's everybody's issue, because this is America. And as we've seen over the last few days, a lot of people are very upset with what happened. You have a police officer killing someone on camera in a place that calls itself the greatest nation in the world. I think, really, there's no magic bullet or any kind of, voodoo or hocus pocus. It's really about people educating themselves and offering themselves as allies in a struggle where they're not in the center of it. I think that's really what it's going to take. Is it's not about you, but your allyship could be very helpful if you recognize that there are fellow citizens who are not getting the same opportunities as so many people, and you want to lend your voice to perhaps help change that. And it's not going to happen overnight. We didn't get here overnight. This is a long-term investment.